Hello and welcome to part 9 of this Kerbal Space Program 2 series going through the For Science Exploration Update. So in the last video we did our final main mission in the Kerbin Sphere of Influence. We do still have the little Chonka mission to do, which requires us to land 200 tons on Minmus, but we'll do that one eventually. But yeah, in this video we're actually going to be going to Duna for the first time. So as you can see, I already have the rocket lined up on the launch pad. But before we can launch, there are a couple of things we need to do. So if we start off by going to Mission Control, you can see that we have 2 new missions available. So the first one is, are there fuel stations in space? And that just requires us to have the X264 Methalox tank and a docking port on our rocket. And the rocket we're going to be using does have those 2 features, so we'll be able to get this mission as soon as we get into orbit around Kerbin, so we'll track that. And the main mission is of course the Duna Monument, which requires us to find the source of the mysterious signal on Duna, so we'll also track that one. And now the other thing we need to do is we need to get ourselves into the correct transfer window, so we'll go to the tracking station, and once there we will zoom out, we will focus on Kerbal, and you can see Duna is right there. And the transfer window for Duna is, if we imagine this is a clock, then we want to get Kerbin at around about 3 o'clock, and we want to have Duna at around about 2 o'clock on its orbit. So we'll warp forwards to get the 2 a bit closer together, and I'm going to use 100 times warp on this, because 1 million times warp is quite a bit faster and it is easy to overdo it. And it's always best to go nice and slowly and make sure that we actually get there. But if you want to know the transfer windows for every single planet in the Kerbal system, there is a specific Delta V map that I use. I'll leave a description or a link in the description for you. It's a map I found on Reddit. And if you want to find it, you can also just Google KSP Delta V map and it'll bring it up. But the idea is that it shows you all of the different transfer angles that you need to get to various different planets. It also gives you stuff like the Delta V stats for the different stages of a launch, and also the ejection angles as well. But the only thing I really pay attention to is the different angle between the different planets. So as you can see, we now have Duna at around about 2 o'clock and Kerbin at 3 o'clock. So now we are ready to launch. So we'll go to Kerbin, and then we will control our Duna Monument lander. So yeah, this is the rocket we're going to use for this mission. I have designed this rocket specifically for the job, and the idea is that we have the main launch vehicle there, and then we essentially have a 3-part lander. And this stage is actually our deorbit stage, which will get us out of orbit around Duna and going down towards the surface. And then we're going to essentially hover across towards the monument, and ideally we're only going to use this stage to do the final part of the actual landing. But yeah, if you want to know how to build this, I do have a build video for this, so please feel free to check that out if you want to follow along. But yeah, anyway, we might as well get straight into the launch. So the first thing we'll do before we even take off is we're going to go to Parts Manager, and we do have an atmospheric survey available on this, and we haven't done that yet in Kerbin's atmosphere. So we'll click on these little sniffer, and we can resize this window as well just to make things a little bit easier. And then as soon as we take off, we'll be able to do our atmospheric survey. So yeah, let's get into the launch. There you can see now we can run an atmospheric survey, and that will do it throughout the launch, and it'll automatically complete in about 2 minutes. But anyway, yeah, for this launch we're going to do a standard launch for me. I do always follow the same launch profile. I will launch to about 2,500 meters above the surface, and then pitch down the 90-degree line on the nav ball until we reach around about 45 degrees in pitch, at which point we will hold there until we reach 85,000 meters apoapsis. And I'm going to skip this launch again, just as I have done in the last few videos, just to save a little bit of time. But if you want to know exactly how I always do my launches, then part 2 of this series does go into a little bit more detail on how to launch into orbit. But yeah, like I say, I'm going to skip through this launch, and once we are in orbit we will get onto our transfer manoeuvre. So you might find with this rocket that it won't always actually do the circularization maneuver properly. So what we can do is, if we go onto the map we can see that our apoapsis is ahead of us, and as long as your apoapsis is ahead of you, what you can do then is, if we just point at prograde on the nav ball, and then once it is there, we're going to warp to a point just ahead of our apoapsis, and we're going to just do a small burn just to bring our periapsis up. And you can see that now we are in orbit, we have automatically completed the Are There Fuel Stations in Space secondary mission. So yeah, now that is done, we can get onto our transfer. Now, if you find that you have launched and you actually haven't already got into the correct transfer window, trying to warp when in orbit can take a long time because we can only get to 100 times warp at the moment. So the way that we would do that is we'd want to go to the tracking station. And the thing is, if you go straight to the tracking station from the ship, you will still be controlling the ship and the warp won't change. So just go to the Kerbal Space Center, then into the tracking station, and then you'll have the full warp capability and you can get yourself into the correct transfer window. But yeah, like I say, that's just if you forgot to get into the transfer window before the launch. But anyway, now we are set to do our transfer. So the first thing we will do is we will create a maneuver around about 45 degrees right of the retrograde line of Kerbin's orbit, because Kerbin is travelling in this direction, and because we're aiming to get to an outer planet, we need to be burning prograde to Kerbin's direction of travel, whereas if we were travelling to an inner planet like Eve, we need to do our manoeuvre on the other side and burn retrograde. But like I say, we're going to start off by placing our manoeuvre around about 45 degrees from the retrograde line of Kerbin, and then we'll zoom out and we will focus on Kerbal. And now we're just going to extend our projected orbit until our orbit line matches up with Duna's orbit line, and we also need to right click on Duna and set that as the target. And now you can see we have the 1A and 2A markers, and I personally don't like going outside of Duna's orbit and then coming back in, so what we're going to do is just going to reduce it a little bit until we only have the 1A and 1B markers. And then if we press home to focus back on the ship and then focus on Kerbin, what we can do is move our manoeuvre node around until we get an encounter, and providing we're in the correct transfer window, we should be able to get an encounter pretty easily. There we go, we are getting an encounter on our second point of approach, so let's have a look and see what our orbit is doing. Yeah, we are going a little bit outside, and that does look, it looks okay to me. It's just, if you are going outside of the orbit, then you are using a little bit more fuel, but it shouldn't cause much of an issue, and we're just going to leave it at that. So let's double click on Duna and see how our actual trajectory is doing. So you can see we're coming across to the right, and I actually want to be coming into Duna on a polar orbit, so we want to be coming straight underneath it. So we'll just use the manoeuvre node to move our trajectory around a little bit until we are coming straight underneath Duna's, Duna. And that should do. And we are actually going to do a mid-course correction on this as well to get ourselves up close to Duna's surface. But now that is set, we can just point our ship at the manoeuvre. And before we do the warp, one thing we do need to do is we need to extend our solar panel. So we'll hit the solar panel button. And for some reason, the non-retractable solar panels aren't actually included in the solar panel action group automatically. So I have set them up so that the non-retractable panels are in the action group. And I've also placed the Communitron in there as well, so that will open automatically. We don't have to do it manually. But yeah, now we are in position, we can warp forwards, and then we can perform this burn. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the map, and then we're going to focus back on Kerbal, and just like any transfer manoeuvre, we want to look down on the Kerbal system, and we're going to wait until our actual orbit line appears and then manage our throttle so we do get a accurate encounter, because it can be very easy to overdo it and end up going too far and having to use more fuel to actually get back. So with longer warps you can do a time warp during a burn. I would recommend not going more than 10 seconds and then cutting 10 times and then cutting around about 10 seconds before the burn ends. But we've only got about 20 seconds left, so I'm just going to leave it at normal speed, and then, as I say, once our orbit line appears we will manage the throttle to get our encounter. And now you can see I think we went a little bit too far there, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to activate RCS and I'm going to boost back to see if we can get our encounter. So there we are, we did actually go a little bit too far, but now we've got our encounter. We will double click on Duna to see how our trajectory is doing. We're coming across a little bit to the left, so we'll try RCS just to bring it across, and I'm pressing N there just to boost back a little bit and get ourselves going right underneath Duna. Anyway, yeah, now we are in our encounter, we need to do our mid-course correction. So as you can see, there are two orbit lines and it can be quite difficult working out which one we need to use. So first of all, we'll move the camera and we will find a place halfway between Kerbin and the entering or encounter marker. And then there's a couple of ways you can know that you are actually on the correct orbit line, because if we were to go onto the wrong one, then we'd end up doing a full orbit and completely missing Duna altogether. So the first thing you can do is, if we mouse over them, you can see when we hit the top line it's only highlighting half of the orbit, whereas when we're doing this bottom line it's highlighting the whole orbit, and that means that the top one is actually the one we want to be on. The other way to find out which you can, or another way you can find out which one is which, is if you click on the orbit you'll see it says T plus 123 days, whereas if we go for the other one it says T plus 1 year. So we know that the top one is the one we want. And just a final thing to make sure you are on the correct one, once you create a maneuver it will bring up the orange Duna periapsis in Duna's sphere of influence, whereas if we were to be on the wrong one nothing would happen there. So that way we know we're definitely on the correct maneuver or the correct orbit line. So when doing mid-course corrections like this, especially when going to a farther out planet, it can be a bit awkward, especially since, as you can see, the maneuver node is all the way over here, but we want to be bringing our trajectory up. So instead of having to constantly move back and forth like that, what we can do is we can warp to the maneuver before we even actually do anything with it. Then once we get close enough it will stop the warp somewhere around 3 hours, so it's actually 2 hours 43 minutes before we need to do the warp. But now you can see the maneuver node is right there and it's much easier to actually do the adjustments we want to do. So as I say, we're going to bring our periapsis up and we are aiming for around about 75 kilometers above the surface on this particular launch. And the reason I'm doing that is because I am planning on rendezvousing and docking with the second stage of this ship to actually refuel after the landing. If you're not planning on rendezvousing and docking, then I would recommend going down to about 60 kilometers above the surface and that will do what you need to do. But yeah, we'll just keep moving our green and purple arrows around until we get to around about 75 kilometers, as I say. And we are getting an encounter with Ike at the moment, but fortunately it is after we would be circularizing our burn, so it's not going to cause a problem. If you do encounter beforehand though, it can really throw things off and cause issues. But anyway, that is just something to be aware of. And now that we're low enough, we're not even encountering it at all. So yeah, we'll keep going until we're around about 75 kilometers above the surface. And like I say, when doing mid-course corrections at such a distance, doing minor adjustments can be quite awkward, which is why we really need to have the ability to change or adjust our manoeuvres on the heads-up display, which you could do in KSP1, but that isn't available yet on this. But hopefully that will come in one of the future updates. Anyway, yeah, now that is set, we need to point at the manoeuvre. And I'm leaving RCS on this because what I've done is I've set up my RCS thrusters so that we have turned off the control for the pitch and yaw. If you haven't done that though, I would recommend turning off RCS, because when pointing at the manoeuvre it will move your trajectory away from the actual manoeuvre node, and that can really mess up your manoeuvres. But like I say, the best way to get around that is just to turn off the pitch and yaw controls on your RCS thrusters, and then it will only control our translation and roll. But anyway, now we are set, we can warp to this manoeuvre and perform the burn. And you can see it's only a 7 delta V burn, so what we're going to do is use partial throttle to bring the trajectory up, and then do the final part of the actual manoeuvre using RCS. .74 will do it. And like I say, I'm doing that because I'm planning on rendezvous and docking, but if you aren't, then just go to 60. So now we need to actually transfer into Duna's sphere of influence. So if we press home on our keyboards to return to our rocket, then what we're going to do is we're actually going to detach the camera and move along our orbit line until we find our point of encounter. And once close enough, it can be a little bit difficult to see, but once you get close enough, you will be able to see that the orbit line has actually broken. So we'll see if I can find it. And yeah, it's a little bit difficult to see at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure we are on the correct orbit, and then we're just going to warp forwards to a point a little way ahead of where we are encountering, because it's quite easy to accidentally hit the wrong orbit and then end up skipping straight through. So we'll click there, we'll hit time warp to point. This is also a good time to quick save as well, obviously. But now we are a little closer. I'll see if I can tell you what I'm trying to point out. So there we are. You can see now that the orbit line has broken, and what that is telling me is that this is our trajectory within Duna's sphere of influence. So what we can do is we can click on a point just inside of there and time warp to point, and this should now bring us inside of Duna's SOI. And there we are. So yeah, now we are ready to do our actual circularization maneuver. But before we do that, what we're going to do is we're actually going to hit the science button, because we've not been to Duna yet, so we can get some science for being in Duna high orbit. Now that's giving us a couple hundred science, and now we're going to create our orbital insertion burn. So as always, we'll create a maneuver on the periapsis, and then we're going to circularize this as usual. And I have had a couple of comments asking if I really spend as much effort actually circularizing my orbit, and the answer is yes, I do. It's like I say, you don't necessarily have to. I find it just makes creating manoeuvres and performing manoeuvres a little bit easier, and especially if we are doing a rendezvous and docking manoeuvre, which we're planning on doing at some point in this mission, then having both of the orbits circular just makes the intercept a little bit easier. But as I say, we're going to just keep playing around with our manoeuvre node until we get a relatively circular orbit. You know, that should do the trick. And now we are set, we can point at the manoeuvre and perform this burn. And you can see that it's saying that we require 727 delta V for this burn, and we only have 734 delta V left in the tank. However, what I find is we quite often have a little bit more delta V left over than we typically should if you do the maths. The reason for that, I believe, is because as we are burning, we're actually losing mass because we're burning fuel. And as we do that, we're getting lighter, which increases our actual ISP, or I think it's the ISP. But anyway, it increases our efficiency, and therefore we will essentially increase our overall delta V. But yeah, now we are positioned on the nav ball. We'll warp to the manoeuvre and perform this burn. so now that's burns done, let's have a look at our actual orbit. So you can see that our periapsis is at about 74 and our apoapsis is at 79. So I am going to circularize this. And like I say, you don't necessarily have to, but I'm going to do this because we're planning on rendezvous and docking. But you can see that we still have 153 delta V left in this stage, and that actually equates to several tons of fuel, which if we click on this little bar here, we can actually see that in the top stage we only need about 8 tons of fuel to have a full tank, and we're not going to use all of this fuel getting back up into orbit, so we're definitely going to have more than enough in this stage to refuel before we go back to Kerbin. But yeah, so that is now set, and like I say, I'm just going to quickly circularize the burn, or circularize the orbit even. We'll do that by warping to the periapsis, pointing at retrograde on the nav ball, and then just using a little bit of throttle to bring our apoapsis down to about 74 or 75. We went a little too far, so I'll use RCS just to boost back again and get ourselves circular. And like I say, you don't have to do this, it's just something I do because I prefer to do it this way, and it's something I've got into the habit of doing over the years of playing KSP. But anyway, now that is set, we are in orbit around Duna. So yeah, I'm going to leave this video here for now because the landing itself is actually quite complicated and I want to focus on that in its own video. So like I say, we'll do that in the next video, but that is basically the easy way to get to Duna and in orbit around the planet. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate if you like and subscribe and maybe let me know what you thought in the comments. And like I say, in the next video we will be doing the landing, so hopefully I will see you in the next one.